Ma'am, you're going to need to step aside for our actual first-class passengers. The words hit Maya Richardson like cold water, but her expression didn't change. She stood at the polished marble counter of JFK Terminal 4's exclusive first-class lounge, her boarding pass clearly marked 1A in her steady hand, watching the reception manager's eyes scan her with practiced dismissal. Patricia Wells had made her decision in less than 3 seconds, the way people always did when they saw a black woman in spaces they believed belonged to others. Maya was 38 years old and worth more money than most small countries, but Patricia didn't know that. She saw expensive clothes without designer logos, understated jewelry, a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence rather than demanding attention. Maya preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that real power didn't announce itself with golden nameplates or flashy displays of wealth. It moved silently, decisively, like water finding the cracks in a foundation. The morning had started before dawn in her Manhattan penthouse 20 floors above a city that never stopped moving. Maya had stood at floor-to-ceiling windows watching early commuters stream across distant bridges like blood cells through arteries while reviewing documents for what would be the most important meeting of her career, Richardson Capital Holdings. The financial empire she had built from nothing was hours away from closing a deal that would reshape European markets and put her company at the center of international banking. Her assistant James had called at 5:30, his voice crisp and efficient over the encrypted line. The Swiss consortium confirmed the meeting for 2 o'clock Zurich time. The bridge loan documentation is ready for signature, and the wire transfer protocols are standing by. $2.2 billion would move with her signature funding acquisitions and mergers across 3 countries. It was the kind of deal that made headlines when it succeeded and destroyed careers when it failed. Maya had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a charcoal cashmere coat that whispered rather than shouted, Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's cars but looked quietly elegant rather than ostentatious. She never wore jewelry beyond a simple watch, never carried bags with visible logos, never dressed in a way that demanded recognition. She had learned that lesson the hard way growing up in Detroit, where showing wealth made you a target, and later in boardrooms where displaying it made you a performance. The ride to JFK had been silent except for the hum of encrypted phones and the soft leather seats of her private car. Maya preferred to think in motion, watching the city blur past while her mind organized the complexities of international finance into clean, executable strategies. She thought about the Swiss bankers she would meet in 8 hours, men who had built their fortunes on discretion and tradition, who would respect her results more than her background if she gave them the chance. But first, she had to get there. Now she stood in the first-class lounge feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being judged before she spoke. Patricia Wells was mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back in a style that suggested authority, wearing the kind of smile that looked warm from a distance but felt cold up close. Her eyes had already moved past Maya toward the door, scanning for passengers she deemed more worthy of attention. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Maya said, her voice steady and calm. She placed her passport next to the boarding pass on the counter, the documents aligned with the precision of someone accustomed to details mattering. "I'm seated in 1A on flight 447 to Zurich." Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She glanced down at the documents with the reluctant attention of someone being asked to solve a problem they didn't believe existed. "The business lounge is down the hall to the left." She repeated, her tone sweetening in a way that felt like condescension wrapped in courtesy. "This lounge is reserved for our first-class and platinum elite members." Maya felt the moment stretch between them, weighted with assumptions and expectations that had shaped too many encounters in her life. She could see other passengers in her peripheral vision, settled into leather armchairs with champagne glasses and financial newspapers, the kind of space she had earned access to long before she could afford it. But Patricia saw something different when she looked at Maya, something that made her certain she was dealing with someone who didn't belong. "I understand," Maya replied, her tone remaining level. "I'm requesting access to the first-class lounge because I have a first-class ticket." She didn't raise her voice or lean forward aggressively. She had learned that showing frustration gave people permission to dismiss her as emotional or difficult. Instead, she waited, letting the silence do the work that anger couldn't. Patricia picked up the boarding pass with 2 fingers, as if it might be contaminated, and scanned the barcode. The machine beeped once, green light flashing confirmation. Maya watched Patricia's expression shift subtly, confusion replacing certainty, as if the technology was contradicting what her eyes had already decided. "There seems to be some kind of error in the system," Patricia murmured, more to herself than to Maya. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, nails clicking against keys with increasing intensity. "Mr. Gregory Blackstone checked in for 1A about 10 minutes ago. He's one of our most valued platinum members." The name landed with recognition that Maya kept hidden behind neutral features. Gregory Blackstone, real estate mogul, old money family, the kind of man who confused inherited privilege with earned authority. Maya knew him by reputation and financial exposure, though they had never met. More importantly, she knew exactly who was funding his upcoming European acquisition, the deal he had been bragging about in business magazines for the past 6 months. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago," Maya said, leaning slightly forward but keeping her voice conversational. "I have a critical meeting in Zurich that cannot be rescheduled. Please resolve this immediately." Patricia's jaw tightened with the kind of irritation that came from having her judgment questioned by someone she had already categorized as beneath concern. "Miss Richardson," she said, reading the name from the passport as if it might be fake. "I can offer you an upgrade to business class with a $500 travel voucher, but Mr. Blackstone has priority status and confirmed international connections." "I cannot move him." The words hung in the air, between them final and absolute. Maya understood exactly what was being said beneath the professional language. Priority belonged to people who looked like they deserved it, and she would be accommodated only after everyone else's comfort was secured. Maya took her documents back with the same steady movements she had used to place them down. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. She had been in this moment too many times to waste energy on displays that changed nothing. "I'll handle this onto the aircraft," she said quietly. Patricia's smile returned bright and dismissive. "Good luck with that." The first-class lounge at JFK Terminal 4 had been designed to make money feel comfortable with itself. Sound dampened to whispers, lighting warmed to golden air, conditioned to the precise temperature where privilege didn't have to think about discomfort. Maya walked through the space she had been denied access to, noting the leather armchairs positioned for privacy, the self-serve bar stocked with top-shelf liquor, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of aircraft like expensive toys arranged on a tarmac playground. She had gained entry through a phone call to the airline's corporate office, a conversation that lasted exactly 90 seconds and involved Maya mentioning her company's name and annual travel expenditure. Suddenly, Patricia had been overruled by someone with a deeper understanding of what Richardson Capital Holdings meant to the airline's bottom line. Maya didn't feel satisfaction from the victory, only the familiar exhaustion that came from having to prove herself worthy of what she had already paid for. Gregory Blackstone sat in the corner alcove spread across a leather sofa like he owned it. 55 years old, silver hair, perfectly styled navy suit that whispered expensive tailoring. He held a crystal tumbler of what looked like aged whiskey, despite the early hour. His phone was pressed to his ear, and his voice carried across the quiet lounge with the unconscious volume of someone accustomed to being heard. "The acquisition closes at noon London time," he was saying, gesturing with his free hand as if the person on the other end could see him. $900 million in bridge financing, all secured. By tomorrow, I'll control the largest commercial real estate portfolio in Western Europe. Maya settled into a chair within earshot, opening her tablet to review meeting notes while listening to Gregory paint himself as a financial mastermind. She knew the details of his deal because Richardson Capital Holdings had underwritten the risk assessment for the European banks providing his bridge loan. The financing was indeed secured, but it flowed through a complex web of international agreements that could be unwound with the right pressure applied at the right moment. The Germans don't understand leverage the way we do. Gregory continued, his voice rising with self-satisfaction. Old world thinking. They're about to learn what American capital can accomplish. Maya glanced up from her tablet, studying his profile. Gregory had the soft features of inherited wealth skin that had never been weathered by actual work hands, that gestured with the casual authority of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. His confidence wasn't built on competence, she realized, but on the assumption that the world would continue arranging itself for his convenience. 20 minutes before boarding, Maya gathered her things and walked toward the gate. The corridor was filled with the usual airport symphony of rolling luggage gate announcements and overlapping conversations in a dozen languages. Flight 447 to Zurich sat at the jetway, a Boeing 777 that looked pristine and patient under the terminal lights. Maya boarded with Group A, her first-class ticket granting her priority access. The aircraft's interior glowed with warm lighting designed to suggest luxury and calm. She turned left into the first-class cabin, a space arranged like a private club with individual suites, sliding doors, polished wood panels, and crystal glassware that caught the light like jewelry. Seat 1, A, was occupied. Gregory Blackstone had made himself comfortable in her assigned seat jacket draped over the ottoman shoes off champagne glass in hand. He was laughing into his phone, completely relaxed in the space he had claimed. When he noticed Maya approaching, his eyes flicked over her with the same dismissive assessment she had received from Patricia, then returned to his conversation without concern. "Excuse me," Maya said, stopping at the entrance to the suite. "You're in my seat." Gregory glanced up again, this time with mild annoyance. "The flight attendant will sort out whatever confusion this is," he said, waving his hand vaguely. "Take any open seat for now." Maya remained standing. "This is seat 1A. I have the boarding pass and reservation confirmation." Gregory's attention finally focused on her completely, his expression shifting from annoyance to something that looked like amusement. "Look," he said, his tone taking on the patient condescension of an adult explaining reality to a child. "I don't know how you ended up with a first-class ticket, but I fly this route twice a month. The crew knows me. This is where I always sit." "Then you'll need to move to your assigned seat," Maya replied, her voice remaining steady. Gregory laughed, a sharp sound that carried no humor. "You're serious?" He looked her up and down again, taking in her understated appearance, her lack of obvious status symbols, her quiet demeanor. "What are you, some kind of diversity hire traveling on the company dime? This is first class, sweetheart. Real first class." The words landed like physical blows, but Maya's expression didn't change. She had heard variations of this dismissal her entire career. The assumption that her success must be charity rather than capability, that her presence in elite spaces required explanation and justification. Before she could respond, footsteps hurried down the aisle. Sarah Chen, the lead flight attendant, appeared with the bright smile and efficient movements of someone trained to diffuse conflict before it disrupted the cabin's careful calm. She was younger than Maya, perhaps early 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested she took pride in her work. "Is there a problem here?" Sarah asked, her voice warm but with an undertone that suggested she had already decided who was at fault. "No problem," Gregory said, settling deeper into the seat. "Just a seating mix-up. This lady seems to think she belongs in 1A. Sarah turned to Maya with the expression of someone preparing to deliver disappointing news gently. "Ma'am, if you could show me your boarding pass, I'd be happy to help you find your correct seat." Maya handed over her documents. Sarah scanned them quickly, her smile faltering slightly as she read the details. This does show 1A, she admitted, but her tone suggested the documents might be fraudulent rather than accurate. Computer error, Gregory said confidently. Happens all the time. I'm sure you can find her something in business. Maybe an upgrade from Coach. Sarah looked between them, clearly uncomfortable, but gravitating toward the solution that would require least disruption to the passenger she recognized as important. Ma'am, I can offer you seat 4B in our business class cabin. It's actually a very nice seat with extra legroom. Maya felt the familiar weight of being asked to accommodate other people's comfort at the expense of her own dignity. The equation was always the same. She could accept the lesser option gracefully, or she could insist on what she had paid for and be labeled difficult, aggressive, unreasonable. I purchased seat 1A, Maya said clearly. I expect to occupy seat 1A. Sarah's smile tightened. Sir, she said, turning to Gregory, would you mind checking your boarding pass? Gregory waved dismissively. I don't need to check anything. I've been flying first class longer than she's been alive, probably. He looked directly at Maya with undisguised contempt. Some people need to learn their place. The words hung in the first-class cabin like smoke from an extinguished match, acrid and impossible to ignore. Maya felt every passenger within earshot go still, the kind of silence that followed statements so blatantly offensive that people needed a moment to process what they had actually heard. Gregory Blackstone had said the quiet part, loud, transforming what might have been dismissed as a seating confusion into something much more revealing and dangerous. Sarah Chen's face flushed red, her professional composure cracking as she realized the situation had escalated beyond her training manual's guidelines for customer service disputes. She looked between Maya and Gregory like a referee who had lost control of a game that was turning violent, uncertain which way to lean, but gravitating instinctively toward the passenger who looked like he belonged. Mr. Blackstone, Sarah said carefully. Perhaps we could just verify both boarding passes, and I'm not verifying anything. Gregory interrupted, his voice rising with the indignation of someone unaccustomed to having his authority questioned. I paid $12,000 for this ticket. I have platinum status with this airline. I fly first class because I can afford first class. He gestured toward Maya with his champagne glass, the crystal catching the cabin light like a weapon. She can sit wherever there's room. Maya remained standing in the aisle, her carry-on still in her hand, watching Gregory reveal himself with every word he spoke. She had encountered men like him throughout her career. Executives who confused access with achievement, who believed that wealth gave them permission to treat others as obstacles to be moved aside. She had learned to recognize the type early, and more importantly, she had learned how to respond. My seat, Maya said quietly, is 1A. Your discomfort with that fact doesn't change the reality. Gregory's laugh was ugly now, stripped of any pretense at civility. My discomfort. He pushed himself up from the seat, standing to his full height as if physical presence might succeed where words had failed. You want to talk about discomfort? You're making everyone on this plane uncomfortable with this ridiculous performance. Sir, please lower your voice, Sarah pleaded, glancing nervously toward the cockpit as if hoping the captain might emerge to restore order. Don't tell me to lower my voice. Gregory snapped, his face reddening with alcohol and anger. I'm not the one causing problems here. She is. He pointed directly at Maya, his finger stabbing the air between them, coming up here with her fake ticket, trying to guilt her way into a seat she didn't pay for. The accusation hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers turned in their seats, no longer pretending not to watch the confrontation unfolding. Maya felt the familiar sensation of being put on trial in a courtroom where the jury had already decided her guilt, forced to defend her right to occupy space she had legitimately purchased. I paid for this seat, Maya said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the passengers who were listening. I have the receipt, the confirmation, and the boarding pass to prove it. Anyone can fake documents these days, Gregory said dismissively. What matters is who belongs here and who doesn't. He settled back into the seat as if the conversation was over, as if his word carried the weight of final judgment. Sarah looked at Maya with an expression that mixed apology with helplessness. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to take the business class seat so we can prepare for departure. If there's been an error, we can sort it out after we're airborne." Maya understood exactly what was being asked of her. Accept the downgrade quietly, don't make waves preserve everyone else's comfort at the expense of her own dignity. She had made that choice countless times before swallowing injustice for the sake of avoiding conflict, telling herself that picking battles wasn't worth the energy. But something had shifted in this moment, watching Gregory's smug satisfaction seeing Sarah's willingness to accommodate discrimination rather than confront it. Maya realized that her silence wasn't protecting anyone except people who didn't deserve protection. "No," Maya said simply. Sarah blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, I said no. I won't be taking the business class seat. I paid for first class. I confirmed first class, and I will sit in first class." Maya's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now, the kind of quiet authority that came from making decisions that couldn't be unmade. Gregory's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're really going to do this? Make a scene over a seat." "You're the one making a scene," Maya replied. "I'm simply trying to sit down." "This is ridiculous," Gregory said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling my attorney. False documents, harassment, disrupting a flight. This little stunt is going to cost you." Maya watched him dial with steady eyes, recognizing the pattern of threats that men like Gregory used when they couldn't control situations through intimidation alone. She had been threatened by experts, people with real power and genuine resources, and she had learned that most threats were performances designed to avoid actual confrontation. Sir Sarah said desperately, "The captain is going to want to speak with both of you if this continues." "Fine by me," Gregory said, the phone pressed to his ear. "He needs to see what kind of passengers you're letting on board these days." Maya felt something crystallize in her mind, a clarity that came when all the variables aligned and the correct course of action became obvious. She looked at Gregory. Really looked at him, taking in his expensive suit and careless confidence, his assumption that the world would arrange itself around his comfort, his complete inability to imagine consequences for his choices. "Make your calls," Maya said quietly. "I'll make mine." She turned and walked back toward the business class cabin, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Behind her she could hear Gregory's voice rising as he complained to whoever had answered his phone about the situation that needed immediate resolution. Sarah followed her partway down the aisle, still trying to manage a crisis that had already moved beyond management. Maya found her assigned business class seat and settled in, placing her carry-on in the overhead compartment with careful precision. The seat was comfortable, the legroom generous, the service undoubtedly excellent. By any objective measure, it was a good seat on a good airline for an important trip. But it wasn't the seat she had paid for, and more importantly, it wasn't the principle she was willing to compromise on. Not anymore. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she rarely used for personal matters. The call connected on the second ring. David Kim speaking. "David, it's Maya. I need you to run a complete risk assessment on Gregory Blackstone and Blackstone Capital. Everything. Financial exposure, credit arrangements pending transactions. I need it now." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, but attention. David Kim was her head of risk management, a former federal banking regulator who understood both the complexities of international finance and the importance of Maya's calls that began with immediate urgency. "What's the time frame?" David asked. Maya glanced at her watch, then toward the front of the plane where she could still hear Gregory's voice carrying over the cabin's engineered quiet. 5 minutes, she said. The business class cabin hummed with the subdued energy of passengers settling in for a transatlantic flight, but Maya Richardson sat perfectly still in seat 4B, her phone pressed to her ear while David Kim's fingers moved across keyboards 3,000 miles away in Richardson Capital Holdings' Manhattan headquarters. Through the gap between seats, she could see into the first-class cabin where Gregory Blackstone continued his animated phone conversation, gesturing with his champagne glass as if conducting an orchestra of outrage. Blackstone Capital's current liquidity position is interesting, David said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who had discovered information that would rearrange someone else's day. They're leveraged to the absolute limit on this European acquisition. Bridge financing of $900 million due to convert to long-term debt at closing, which is scheduled for noon Eastern. Maya finished. 3 hours from now. Exactly. But here's what makes it fascinating from a risk perspective. David's keyboard clicks accelerated. The bridge loan isn't coming from traditional commercial banks. It's structured through a consortium of European institutions. But the underlying guarantees flow through 3 different shell companies that ultimately trace back to... Maya closed her eyes, already knowing what David was going to say. Richardson Capital Holdings had grown large enough and diversified enough that she couldn't track every subsidiary arrangement, every financial web that connected her company to deals across 6 continents. But David's tone told her everything she needed to know. Us, she said. Specifically, Richardson International Risk Management, which is a wholly owned subsidiary that provides loan guarantees for high-risk international transactions. Blackstone Capital's European acquisition is being financed with money that we're ultimately responsible for if anything goes wrong. Maya opened her eyes and looked toward the first-class cabin where Gregory was now standing in the aisle. His voice carrying clearly as he complained to someone about the security issue that needed to be resolved before the plane could depart. The irony was perfect and terrible. He was demanding her removal from a flight that was being paid for indirectly but definitively by the company she had built. What happens if we invoke the morality clause? Maya asked. David was quiet for a moment. The morality clause was a standard provision that Richardson Capital included in high-risk international loans, allowing them to freeze funding if the borrower engaged in behavior that could damage the reputation of associated financial institutions. It was rarely used, designed more as insurance than as a weapon, but it existed for exactly these situations. Complete financial catastrophe, David said finally. The bridge loan gets called immediately. Without that liquidity, the European acquisition fails, which triggers penalty clauses with the sellers. Blackstone Capital would lose their deposit, probably around $50 million, and face lawsuits from multiple parties. The company would be effectively bankrupt within hours. Maya watched Gregory through the gap between seats, noting the casual cruelty in his posture, the way he gestured dismissively when talking about her to whoever was listening on his phone. He had built his wealth on the assumption that his comfort mattered more than other people's dignity, and now he was about to learn what happened when those assumptions met consequences. The $900 million, Maya said. Where exactly is it right now? Sitting in an escrow account at Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt, waiting for final authorization to transfer at 11:59 Eastern. All it takes is one phone call to freeze those funds pending review. Maya's throat felt dry. The power to destroy someone's life completely was not something she had ever wanted, but Gregory's behavior had forced her hand. She thought about all the times she had remained silent when faced with discrimination, all the moments when she had chosen dignity over confrontation, because the cost of fighting seemed too high. David, I want you to understand something clearly. Maya said, her voice low enough that other passengers couldn't overhear. The man in seat 1. A just told me I needed to learn my place. He accused me of using fake documents to steal a seat I didn't deserve. He's currently on his phone trying to have me removed from this aircraft. Understood, David said, and Maya could hear the steel in his voice. David had worked in federal banking regulation for 15 years before joining Richardson Capital. He understood exactly how discrimination complaints could destroy financial institutions, and more importantly, he understood Maya well enough to know that she didn't make requests like this lightly. Initiate the risk assessment review, Maya said. Flag it as reputational exposure due to executive behavioral concerns. Freeze the bridge loan pending investigation. Time frame. Maya looked at her watch. Immediately, she ended the call and placed the phone face down on the tray table. Her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she had just set in motion. Around her, passengers read newspapers and magazines, scrolled through phones prepared for a routine flight across the Atlantic. None of them could have imagined that a decision worth $900 million had just been made 3 rows behind them. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell. We're expecting a brief delay for some final paperwork, but we should be airborne within the next few minutes. Flight time to Zurich will be approximately 7 hours and 15 minutes. Maya settled back in her seat, closing her eyes as the plane's engines began to wind up. She thought about the Swiss bankers waiting for her in Zurich, the meetings that would reshape European financial markets, the empire she had built from nothing through careful planning and relentless execution. None of that had changed in the past 10 minutes, but everything else had. She opened her phone and scrolled to her assistant's number, typing a quick message. Schedule conference call with legal team for this afternoon. Potential discrimination lawsuit, airline industry. Need full documentation. The reply came back within 30 seconds. Already on it. James is pulling all receipts and confirmation numbers. Full legal review initiated. Maya smiled slightly. She had learned to surround herself with people who understood not just her business, but her principles. They knew that she didn't make decisions like this casually, and they were already moving to support whatever came next. From the first-class cabin, Gregory's voice carried back louder now and edged with frustration. "What do you mean you can't reach him? It's the middle of the business day in New York. Someone needs to handle this immediately." Maya checked her watch again. 2 minutes since she had given David the authorization. The financial markets moved at the speed of light, but bureaucratic processes took time. Somewhere in Frankfurt, a computer system was updating account statuses, freezing access to funds that Gregory was counting on to close the biggest deal of his career. She wondered how long it would take for him to realize what was happening. How long before the phone calls started coming in from lawyers and accountants and European banking executives who would have to explain why $900 million had suddenly become unavailable. The plane pushed back from the gate, beginning its slow taxi toward the runway. Through the window, Maya could see the lights of New York fading behind them, the city where she had built her fortune, and learned that power was only meaningful when it was used to protect principles that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Doan. "Bridge loan frozen, pending review. Expect fireworks in approximately 60 seconds. Maya turned off her phone and tucked it into her purse. Whatever happened next, she wanted to experience it without distractions, wanted to see justice unfold in real time with the clarity it deserved. From the first-class cabin, Gregory Blackstone's voice suddenly changed pitch, rising with a note of panic that cut through the aircraft's ambient noise like a knife. "What do you mean the wire was declined?" The change in Gregory Blackstone's voice was immediate and visceral, transforming from confident indignation to something approaching panic in the space between heartbeats. Maya Richardson remained perfectly still in seat 4. B. Her eyes closed as if resting while sounds from the first-class cabin painted a precise picture of a man's world beginning to collapse in real time. "Run it again." Gregory snapped into his phone, but the edge of authority had already begun to crumble. "That's impossible. I've been banking with them for 20 years. Through the gap between seats, Maya could see his silhouette gesticulating more frantically now, the champagne glass forgotten on his tray table, as both hands worked to hold his phone steady. Other first-class passengers had begun to notice the disturbance conversations dying mid-sentence, as Gregory's voice carried across the cabin with increasing desperation. "What do you mean, compliance review?" Gregory's voice cracked slightly on the words. "There's nothing to review. Everything was approved weeks ago." Maya opened her eyes and glanced at her watch. 3 minutes since David had initiated the asset freeze. The timing was perfect, surgical in its precision. European banks would be starting their afternoon sessions. American markets hitting their mid-morning peak, and somewhere in the complex web of international finance, automated systems were executing protocols that would unravel Gregory's carefully constructed empire one wire transfer at a time. Sir Sarah Chen's voice drifted back from the first-class cabin, tentative and concerned. "Is everything all right? We're preparing for takeoff." "Nothing is all right," Gregory barked, his composure completely shattered now. "Someone has frozen my accounts. This is corporate sabotage. I need to get off this plane immediately." Maya heard Captain Mitchell's voice crackle over the intercom again. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure. We've been cleared for takeoff." No, Gregory's shout was loud enough to carry throughout the entire aircraft. "Stop the plane! I need to get off! There's been some kind of mistake." Maya could hear other passengers murmuring now, the low hum of concern that rippled through confined spaces when someone began to behave erratically. She remained motionless, letting the drama unfold without her participation, understanding that Gregory was about to learn the difference between actual power and the illusion of authority that money could buy. "Mr. Blackstone." Sarah's voice had taken on the firm tone of someone trained to handle in-flight emergencies. "You need to take your seat and fasten your seatbelt. We cannot return to the gate once we've been cleared for departure." "You don't understand," Gregory said, his voice climbing toward hysteria. "I'm losing everything. Someone has sabotaged the most important deal of my career. I need to get back to New York right now." Maya's phone, though turned off, rested in her purse like a loaded weapon. She knew that even now, David would be fielding calls from European bankers, German lawyers, Swiss financial regulators, all trying to understand why $900 million had suddenly become unavailable 30 minutes before a deal that had taken months to arrange. The cascade of consequences would be building momentum with each passing minute, creating a financial avalanche that no amount of Gregory's shouting could stop. "Sir, please return to your seat." Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, no longer warm and routine, but carrying the authority of someone who had decided that a situation required intervention. "We have been cleared for departure and cannot delay further." "I'm not taking my seat," Gregory responded, his voice now audible to everyone on the aircraft. "I'm a Platinum member. I demand to speak to someone in authority. This is kidnapping." Maya heard footsteps moving quickly down the aisle, the purposeful stride of crew members responding to a passenger who had crossed the line from difficult to dangerous. She opened her eyes slightly and saw 2 flight attendants approaching Gregory's seat, their faces set with professional determination. "Mr. Blackstone." One of them said, a senior attendant Maya hadn't met. "I need you to sit down and fasten your seatbelt immediately, or we will be forced to restrain you." "Restrain me?" Gregory's laugh was bitter and desperate. "Do you know who I am? I own buildings in 3 countries. I employ 2,000 people. You cannot restrain me." Maya almost smiled at the irony. Gregory was still thinking in terms of his old identity, the version of himself that had existed 15 minutes ago when his net worth included assets that were no longer accessible to him. He didn't yet understand that wealth without liquidity was just numbers on paper, that power without funding was just noise. "I don't care who you are," the flight attendant replied with the kind of calm authority that suggested extensive training in crisis management. "Right now, you are a passenger on this aircraft, and you will follow the captain's instructions or face federal charges for interfering with a flight crew." The plane had begun to accelerate down the runway, the familiar pressure of takeoff pushing passengers back into their seats. Maya felt the aircraft lift off, wheels retracting with mechanical precision, but the cabin remained tense with the energy of Gregory's meltdown. "This is insane," Gregory muttered, his voice finally dropping to a level that suggested he was beginning to understand the hopelessness of his situation. 6 hours ago, I was closing the biggest deal of my career. Now everything is frozen, and I'm trapped on a plane to Switzerland with no way to fix it. Maya heard the distinctive sound of someone scrolling through contacts on a phone, followed by rapid dialing. Gregory was making another call, probably to his legal team, possibly to his wife, certainly to anyone who might be able to explain how his world had imploded so completely and so quickly. Patricia, Gregory said, his voice taking on a desperate politeness. "Thank God you answered. Something terrible is happening. All of our accounts are frozen. The European deal is falling apart. I need you to call Jonathan at the bank immediately and find out." Maya couldn't hear the response from Gregory's wife, but she could extrapolate from his side of the conversation that it wasn't going well. His voice took on a pleading quality that suggested he was not receiving the support he had expected. "What do you mean you can't help? This is our money, our company, our future. I don't care if you're at the spa. This is more important than your appointment." The conversation continued for several minutes, Gregory's voice alternating between commands and pleas while Maya listened to what sounded like the dissolution of both a business partnership and a marriage happening simultaneously at 30,000 feet. "Fine," Gregory said, finally, the word sharp with bitterness. "Handle it however you want, but don't expect me to protect you when the lawyers start asking questions." He ended the call and immediately began dialing another number. Maya counted at least 6 more calls over the next 20 minutes, each one following the same pattern. Initial confidence giving way to confusion. Confusion turning to desperation, and desperation ultimately colliding with the reality that no one could help him. "Mr. Blackstone." Sarah Chen's voice cut through his latest conversation, polite but firm. "The captain would like to speak with you." Maya heard footsteps approaching from the cockpit, and then Captain Mitchell's voice deeper and more serious than it had sounded over the intercom. "Sir, I'm going to need you to end your phone calls and explain to me why you've been disrupting this flight," Captain Gregory said, and Maya could hear him trying to summon his old authority, the voice he used in board meetings and business negotiations. "There's been a terrible mistake. Someone has sabotaged my company's financing. I need to return to New York immediately to resolve this." "That's not how aviation works," Captain Mitchell replied. "Once we're airborne, we proceed to our destination unless there's a genuine emergency. What you're describing sounds like a business problem, not a flight emergency." "A business problem?" Gregory's voice rose again. "I'm losing $900 million. My company is being destroyed." "How is that not an emergency?" Maya felt a strange sense of satisfaction hearing Gregory finally name the exact amount he was losing, confirming that David's intelligence had been accurate and that the asset freeze was working exactly as intended. Sir Captain Mitchell said with the patience of someone accustomed to managing difficult passengers, "I sympathize with your situation, but I cannot divert this aircraft for financial difficulties. You'll have several hours during the flight to work on resolving your business issues, and you'll have full access to communications once we reach Zurich." "This is unacceptable," Gregory said, but his voice had lost its combative edge. He was beginning to understand that he was no longer in an environment where his demands carried weight that altitude had stripped him of the influence he was accustomed to wielding on the ground. Maya settled deeper into her seat, finally allowing herself to relax as the crisis phase of Gregory's meltdown transitioned into what would likely be hours of desperate phone calls and increasingly frantic attempts to salvage a situation that was already beyond salvation. Through her window, clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, white and peaceful and indifferent to the human drama playing out inside the aircraft. Maya thought about the Swiss bankers waiting for her in Zurich, probably unaware that the financial landscape of their afternoon meetings had just shifted dramatically. She thought about her own company, Richardson Capital Holdings, and how this moment would either strengthen her reputation as someone who didn't tolerate discrimination or create complications she would have to navigate carefully. Most of all, she thought about every time someone had assumed she didn't belong somewhere, every moment when she had been asked to accommodate other people's prejudices for the sake of keeping peace every instance, when she had chosen silence over confrontation because fighting seemed too costly. This time she had chosen differently, and Gregory Blackstone was learning that assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. Captain Mitchell returned to the cockpit after his conversation with Gregory Blackstone, but the tension in the first-class cabin continued to simmer like pressure in a sealed container. Maya Richardson could hear Gregory making call after call, his voice cycling between rage and desperation, as he tried to understand how his financial empire had crumbled in the space of an hour. She remained perfectly still in seat 4, eyes closed, listening to the sound of consequences catching up with choices. "Yes, I understand the money is frozen," Gregory was saying, his voice hoarse from shouting. "What I don't understand is why. We've never missed a payment, never defaulted on anything. Someone is doing this to me deliberately." Maya opened her eyes and checked her watch. They had been airborne for 45 minutes, which meant Gregory's European partners would be waking up to discover that their afternoon meeting to finalize the biggest real estate acquisition in recent memory would not be happening as scheduled. Phone calls would be flying between London, Frankfurt, and Zurich as lawyers and bankers tried to understand how a deal worth nearly $1 billion had evaporated without warning. "Mr. Blackstone." Sarah Chen's voice carried from the first-class cabin more concerned now than annoyed. "You've been on the phone continuously since takeoff. Other passengers are trying to rest. Other passengers don't have $900 million disappearing while they're trapped in an aluminum tube over the Atlantic Ocean." Gregory snapped back, but his voice cracked on the words, revealing the panic he could no longer hide. Maya heard new footsteps in the aisle, heavier and more authoritative than the flight attendants. Captain Mitchell was returning, probably with the manifest in hand, possibly with questions that would change the entire dynamic of what had been happening on his aircraft. "Mr. Blackstone." The captain said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had made a decision. "I've been reviewing our passenger manifest, and I need to ask you some questions about the incident that occurred before takeoff." "What incident?" Gregory's voice climbed toward defensiveness. "You mean when that woman tried to steal my seat, I handled that appropriately." Maya felt her phone buzz in her purse, but she ignored it. Whatever messages were coming in could wait. This moment required her full attention. According to the crew report, Captain Mitchell continued, "You refused to show your boarding pass when asked, made disparaging comments about another passenger, and accused her of using fraudulent documents to gain access to first class." She was using fraudulent documents, Gregory insisted. Or at least suspicious ones. "I've been flying this route for years. I know who belongs in first class and who doesn't." Maya heard the captain's footsteps moving down the aisle, coming closer to her section of the aircraft. She opened her eyes and saw him approaching, holding what looked like a printed passenger manifest and several official-looking documents. "Miss Richardson," Captain Mitchell said, stopping beside her seat. His voice was completely different now, respectful and slightly apologetic. "I apologize for disturbing you, but I wonder if I might have a word." Maya looked up at him, noting the change in his demeanor from the professional courtesy he had shown earlier to something approaching deference. "Of course, Captain. I've been reviewing your travel profile and our passenger manifest," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience you experienced during boarding. The crew should have resolved the seating issue immediately." Behind them, Gregory's voice had gone quiet, but Maya could feel his attention focusing on their conversation like a predator sensing danger. "Thank you, Captain," Maya said calmly. "I appreciate your concern." Captain Mitchell glanced toward the first-class cabin, then back to Maya. "Miss Richardson, I wonder if you're aware that Richardson Capital Holdings is the majority stakeholder in the leasing consortium that owns this aircraft." The words landed in the cabin like a physical impact. Maya heard Gregory's sharp intake of breath, followed by complete silence as the implications began to penetrate his alcohol-fogged mind. "I am aware of that," Maya said simply. "And you're the Maya Richardson." "The CEO. I am." Captain Mitchell straightened slightly, his expression shifting to something that looked like embarrassment mixed with professional concern. "Miss Richardson, on behalf of the airline and the crew, I want to apologize for the treatment you received. This is completely unacceptable, and I assure you that there will be consequences." Maya heard shuffling from the first-class cabin, followed by Gregory's voice, smaller now and uncertain. "What did he just say?" Captain Mitchell turned toward the sound, his expression hardening. "He said that the woman you accused of fraud, the woman you told to learn her place, the woman you had removed from the seat she paid for, effectively owns this aircraft." The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Maya could almost hear Gregory's mind working, connecting dots that revealed the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he had dismissed as a diversity hire trying to steal his seat was the same woman whose company controlled the financing for his European acquisition, whose business decisions could make or break deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "That's impossible," Gregory said, but his voice was barely a whisper. Maya stood slowly, smoothing her coat as she prepared to reclaim what had always been hers. "Captain, I would like to return to my assigned seat now." "Of course," Captain Mitchell said immediately. "I'll escort you personally." They walked together toward the first-class cabin, Maya's footsteps steady and unhurried. As they approached seat 1, Gregory looked up at her with an expression of dawning horror, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You," he said, his voice cracking. "You did this to me." Maya looked down at him calmly. "I did nothing to you. You did this to yourself. But the accounts, the frozen assets, the deal falling apart, are the consequences of your behavior." Maya finished. "When you told me to learn my place, when you accused me of fraud, when you assumed I didn't belong here, you revealed exactly the kind of person you are. The kind of person whose judgment cannot be trusted with $900 million. Gregory's face went white as the full scope of his situation became clear. The woman he had humiliated was not just wealthy, she was the source of his wealth, the foundation upon which his entire business empire was built. And he had attacked that foundation out of nothing more than prejudice and arrogance. "Miss Richardson," he said, his voice taking on a desperate, pleading quality. "Please. There's been a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were." "That's exactly the problem," Maya replied, settling into seat 1A as Gregory scrambled to collect his belongings from the space he no longer had any right to occupy. "You didn't think it mattered who I was?" Captain Mitchell stood nearby, his expression grim as he watched Gregory realize that his assumptions had cost him everything. "Mr. Blackstone, you'll need to move to another seat immediately." "Where am I supposed to go?" Gregory asked, looking around the cabin as if hoping to find sanctuary that didn't exist. "There's an available seat in economy," Sarah Chen said, appearing with a boarding pass in her hand. "Row 34E. The reversal was complete and devastating. Gregory Blackstone, who had boarded the aircraft believing he owned the world, would spend the next 6 hours in a middle seat at the back of the plane contemplating how quickly arrogance could transform into humiliation. As he gathered his things and walked toward the rear of the aircraft, Maya closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Not because she had destroyed someone's life, but because she had finally chosen to fight back against the assumptions that had limited her for too long. Justice, she realized, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was simply about truth being revealed in places where lies had been comfortable for too long. At 38,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Maya Richardson finally experienced the first-class service she had paid for. But the victory felt hollow against the backdrop of a man's complete financial destruction happening one row behind her. She had claimed Seat 1A not through confrontation or legal threats, but through the simple revelation of truth, and now Gregory Blackstone sat in economy class making increasingly desperate phone calls while his business empire continued its free fall in real time. Sarah Chen approached Maya's seat with the nervous energy of someone whose professional future might depend on the next few minutes. She carried a crystal glass of champagne and wore the kind of smile that people practiced in mirrors when they needed to apologize for something that couldn't be undone. "Miss Richardson," Sarah said, her voice soft with genuine remorse, "I want to personally apologize for my behavior earlier. There's no excuse for how I handled the situation." Maya accepted the champagne but didn't drink it immediately. "Thank you for the apology," she said, studying Sarah's face for signs of sincerity versus performance. "What concerns me more than your initial reaction is how quickly you were willing to accommodate discrimination when it seemed easier than addressing it." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, revealing someone who was genuinely grappling with the implications of her choices. "You're absolutely right. I saw a conflict and chose to support the passenger I assumed had more authority without questioning whether that assumption was fair or accurate. And now," Maya asked, "now I understand that assumptions can be very dangerous, especially when they're based on nothing more than appearance and prejudice." Sarah paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Miss Richardson, I know this doesn't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I've requested additional training on discrimination issues. This experience has shown me blind spots I didn't know I had." Maya nodded, recognizing the difference between an apology designed to avoid consequences and one that reflected genuine understanding. "That's a good start," she said. "The question is whether the airline itself will learn from this or treat it as an isolated incident." From the economy section, Gregory's voice carried forward no longer the confident booming that had filled the first-class cabin, but a desperate whisper that somehow seemed louder because of its intensity. "You have to understand this isn't just about money. My reputation, my family's future, everything depends on salvaging this deal." Maya pulled out her phone, which had been buzzing intermittently since takeoff, and scrolled through messages from David Kim. The updates painted a picture of methodical financial destruction that was both impressive and terrifying in its scope. "European partners have officially withdrawn from consortium," one message read. "Estimated losses approaching $75 million in forfeit deposits. Legal challenges expected from multiple jurisdictions." Another message, time-stamped 20 minutes later, "Mrs. Blackstone has filed for emergency divorce proceedings, seeking to protect personal assets from business liability." Maya closed her phone and looked out the window at clouds that stretched endlessly in every direction. The physical distance from the consequences of her decision should have provided perspective, but instead it highlighted the strange intimacy of commercial aviation, the way 30,000 feet above the earth became its own ecosystem, where actions and reactions played out in compressed time and space. "Miss Richardson." Captain Mitchell's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him approaching with the measured steps of someone who had been thinking carefully about a conversation he needed to have. "Captain, I wanted to update you on the situation. Mr. Blackstone has been cooperative since the seat change, but he's received some news that has him quite distressed. I wanted to ask if you felt comfortable continuing the flight with him aboard." Maya considered the question carefully. Gregory was no longer a threat to her physical safety, but the dynamic on the aircraft had shifted into something unprecedented. She was traveling with someone whose life she had effectively ended, whose financial destruction was continuing to unfold in real time, and there were still 5 hours remaining until they reached Zurich. "What kind of news?" Maya asked. Captain Mitchell lowered his voice. "Apparently his wife has filed for divorce and is seeking to freeze their joint assets. His legal team has advised him not to leave the country, which puts him in a difficult position since we're currently over the Atlantic Ocean." Maya felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, quickly suppressed by the memory of Gregory's behavior and the casual cruelty of his assumptions. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Blackstone made his choices. I'm not responsible for managing the consequences." "Understood. I just wanted to ensure you felt safe." "I do. But I also want to be clear that if Mr. Blackstone approaches me or attempts to engage me in conversation about his business situation, I will consider that harassment." Captain Mitchell nodded. "I'll make sure the crew understands." As the captain returned to the cockpit, Maya settled back in her seat and allowed herself to process what she had accomplished. The seat in first class had never been about comfort or status. It had been about the principle that her contract and her dignity deserved the same respect that would automatically be given to someone who looked different from her. But the consequences had grown far beyond anything she could have anticipated. What had started as a discrimination incident had revealed a web of financial relationships that gave her the power to destroy a man's entire life, and she had used that power without hesitation. She thought about the meetings waiting for her in Zurich, the Swiss bankers who would probably have heard about Gregory's collapse by the time she landed, the way this story would spread through financial networks and become part of her reputation. Maya Richardson, the woman who didn't tolerate disrespect, who had the resources and the willingness to enforce consequences for discrimination. It would make some people more careful around her, which was probably good. It would make others afraid of her, which might be necessary. And it would ensure that she never again had to endure the particular humiliation of being told she didn't belong in a space she had legitimately claimed. From economy class, Gregory's voice had gone quiet, replaced by what sounded like sobbing. Maya didn't turn around to look. She had seen enough men cry when their assumptions about the world proved incorrect, and she felt no obligation to provide comfort to someone whose pain was entirely self-inflicted. Instead, she opened her laptop and began reviewing the presentation she would give in Zurich, the financial models and market analyses that would shape the next phase of her company's growth. The work continued regardless of personal drama, and Maya had learned long ago that success came from focusing on what she could control rather than dwelling on what she couldn't. The plane flew on through clear skies toward Switzerland, carrying its cargo of passengers toward destinations they had chosen, consequences they had earned, and futures they were still in the process of creating. Zurich's financial district gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight like a collection of glass and steel monuments to precision, discretion, and the kind of wealth that preferred to work without drawing attention to itself. Maya Richardson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor conference room, watching the city spread out below her, while Swiss bankers shuffled through documents and spoke in the hushed tones that international finance demanded. The flight had landed 3 hours ago, but news of Gregory Blackstone's financial collapse had arrived ahead of her. Heinrich Vogel, chairman of the Swiss banking consortium that had been expecting to finalize nearly $1 billion in real estate transactions, had greeted Maya at the airport with the particular combination of respect and wariness that came from dealing with someone whose reputation had just been dramatically enhanced. "Miss Richardson," Heinrich said, approaching her position at the window with a thick folder in his hands. "I must say your handling of the Blackstone situation has created quite a stir in our circles. Very efficient, very decisive." Maya turned from the window, noting the careful neutrality in Heinrich's expression. Swiss bankers were trained not to reveal their opinions about their clients' methods, only their results, but she could sense the mixture of admiration and concern that her actions had generated. "Mr. Vogel," Maya replied, "I assume the Blackstone matter will not affect our scheduled discussions. On the contrary, it has enhanced them considerably." Heinrich opened the folder, revealing documents that Maya recognized as acquisition agreements, property portfolios, and financial projections. "The collapse of Blackstone Capital has created opportunities that we would like to discuss with Richardson Capital Holdings." Maya moved to the conference table where representatives from 3 Swiss banks and 2 German financial institutions sat with the kind of patient attention that suggested important decisions were about to be made. She had planned this meeting to discuss expanding her company's European presence, but Gregory's downfall had apparently accelerated timelines that might otherwise have taken months to develop. The Manhattan commercial properties that Blackstone was attempting to acquire said, Dr. Elizabeth Weber from Credit Suisse, sliding a bound report across the table, are now available through forced liquidation. The sellers are motivated to close quickly to avoid further legal complications. Maya opened the report, scanning financial projections that showed European real estate values at their most attractive levels in years. Gregory's failed acquisition had created a ripple effect that was driving down prices and creating opportunities for investors with available capital and clean reputations. The purchase price, Maya asked. Approximately 60% of the original Blackstone offer, Heinrich replied. The sellers are prioritizing speed and certainty over maximum return. Maya felt a strange symmetry in the moment. Gregory Blackstone had attempted to build his European empire through leverage and borrowed money, assuming that his reputation and connections would be sufficient to sustain deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Now she was being offered the same properties at a significant discount, with the added benefit of Gregory's failure serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of character in high-stakes international finance. There is, of course, the matter of due diligence, Dr. Weber continued. Given the circumstances surrounding Mr. Blackstone's difficulties, European regulators are taking a particularly close look at discrimination issues in international business practices. Maya looked up from the documents, recognizing the delicate way that Swiss bankers addressed sensitive topics. Are you concerned about Richardson Capital's involvement in the asset freeze? Not concerned, Heinrich said carefully. Impressed. You demonstrated that your company takes reputational risk seriously, that you're willing to enforce behavioral standards even when it's financially costly to do so. It wasn't costly, Maya replied. It was profitable. Gregory Blackstone's behavior revealed exactly the kind of judgment that makes someone unsuitable for managing large-scale international transactions. The Swiss bankers exchanged glances that suggested Maya had given the answer they had hoped to hear. In a business built on trust and long-term relationships, her willingness to prioritize principle over short-term financial gain had actually enhanced her value as a partner rather than diminishing it. Maya's phone buzzed with a message from David Kim Blackstone Capital, officially filed for bankruptcy protection 20 minutes ago. All assets frozen pending creditor negotiations. Estimated final losses approaching $200 million. She closed the phone without responding, her attention focused on the opportunities that failure had created rather than dwelling on the destruction itself. Gregory's collapse was no longer her concern. Her company's growth was. Gentlemen, Maya said, looking around the table at faces that represented some of the most conservative financial institutions in the world, I think we have the foundation for a very productive partnership. The negotiations continued for 2 hours, covering property acquisitions, currency hedging, regulatory compliance, and the complex web of international agreements that would allow Richardson Capital Holdings to expand into European markets with the backing of institutions that valued stability and discretion above all else. When the meetings concluded, Maya found herself on the terrace of the bank's executive dining room, sharing a quiet dinner with Heinrich, while the lights of Zurich glittered below them like scattered diamonds. May I ask you a personal question? Heinrich said, setting down his wine glass with the precision that characterized everything Swiss bankers did. Of course. Do you regret what happened to Mr. Blackstone? Maya considered the question while looking out over the city where fortunes were made and lost with equal efficiency. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. But I don't regret that it happened. Heinrich nodded as if this answer satisfied some internal calculation. In our business, reputation is everything. What you did on that aircraft was not revenge, it was risk management. Very sophisticated risk management. Maya smiled slightly. I've learned that the most dangerous risks often come from people who assume they don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Indeed. And now every executive in Europe knows that Richardson Capital Holdings enforces those rules even when it's inconvenient to do so. As the evening concluded and Maya prepared to return to her hotel, she reflected on how completely the dynamics of her European expansion had changed in the space of a single day. What she had envisioned as months of careful relationship building and gradual market entry had become an immediate opportunity to acquire premium assets at discounted prices, backed by institutions that now viewed her as a partner who could be trusted with their most sensitive transactions. Gregory Blackstone's assumption that she didn't belong in first class had cost him everything, and given her access to opportunities that might not have been available under any other circumstances. Just as Maya realized sometimes worked in ways that were more efficient and elegant than any revenge could ever be. The story broke in the financial press exactly 72 hours after Maya Richardson's flight landed in Zurich, beginning with a brief mention in the Wall Street Journal's morning report, and escalating by afternoon into the kind of corporate drama that business networks covered with breathless intensity. Airline discrimination incident triggers $900 million. Financial collapse ran across CNBC's ticker, while Bloomberg dedicated an entire segment to what analysts were calling the most expensive act of prejudice in recent financial history. Maya watched the coverage from her Manhattan office 20 floors above a city that was already adjusting its understanding of her influence and her willingness to use it. The story had been simplified for mass consumption into a neat narrative of discrimination and consequences, but the financial industry understood the deeper implications of what had happened above the Atlantic Ocean. David Kim knocked on her office door at precisely 10 in the morning, carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression of someone who had been fielding phone calls from reporters, lawyers, and federal regulators for the past 3 days. "The SEC wants a full briefing on our risk management protocols," David said, settling into the chair across from Maya's desk. "They're not investigating us. They're trying to understand how we identified and responded to reputational risks so quickly." Maya opened the folder, scanning documents that detailed the complete financial autopsy of Gregory Blackstone's empire. The numbers told a story of leveraged speculation held together by nothing more than confidence and credit. A house of cards that had collapsed the moment its foundation was questioned. "Blackstone Capital's final filing?" Maya asked. "Bankruptcy protection approved yesterday. Personal assets estimated at -$40 million after legal fees and creditor claims. The house in the Hamptons is already in foreclosure." Maya closed the folder, feeling no satisfaction from Gregory's complete financial destruction, but recognizing the brutal efficiency with which markets eliminated participants who couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. "What about the discrimination lawsuit? 3 law firms have reached out, but we're in a unique position. You were the victim of discrimination who had the power to respond immediately and proportionally. Most civil rights attorneys are calling it the perfect case study in how financial markets can enforce behavioral standards more effectively than traditional legal remedies." Maya's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but David's expression suggested she should answer it. "This is Maya Richardson. Miss Richardson, this is Patricia Wells, from JFK Terminal 4. Maya felt a moment of surprise, followed by curiosity about why the woman who had initially denied her access to the first-class lounge would be calling her directly. "Ms. Wells, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I wanted to apologize personally for my behavior and to let you know that I've been terminated by the airline. My actions violated multiple company policies regarding customer service and discrimination." Maya leaned back in her chair, noting the careful phrasing that suggested Patricia was reading from prepared notes, possibly with legal counsel listening. "I appreciate your call," Maya said. "I hope this experience has been educational." "It has been. More than I expected." Patricia's voice carried genuine remorse rather than the performative apology Maya had anticipated. "Miss Richardson, I want you to know that I've enrolled in sensitivity training, and I'm looking for work in an industry where I can learn to treat people better." Maya ended the call thoughtfully, recognizing that individual accountability was extending beyond Gregory Blackstone to include everyone who had participated in the discrimination she had experienced. The airline industry she knew was notoriously insular and reputation-dependent, meaning that Patricia's dismissal would likely follow her to any similar position she might seek. "The ripple effects are broader than we anticipated," David said, interpreting her expression correctly. "American Airlines has implemented new training protocols for all customer-facing staff. 3 other major carriers have announced policy reviews. The airline industry is treating this as a case study in how quickly discrimination incidents can escalate into corporate liability." Maya stood and walked to her office window, looking down at streets filled with people who had no idea that the balance of power in several industries had shifted slightly but definitively in the past week. The story had become larger than Gregory Blackstone's personal destruction, larger even than her own vindication, evolving into a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of prejudice in interconnected global markets. "There's something else," David said, checking his phone. "Gregory Blackstone has requested a meeting with you." Maya turned from the window, surprised. "He's still in Switzerland. He can't leave. His passport was flagged by federal marshals pending resolution of the bankruptcy proceedings. He's effectively stranded in Zurich with no assets and mounting legal bills." Maya felt a complex mixture of emotions about Gregory's situation. His suffering was entirely self-inflicted, the direct result of choices he had made based on assumptions that had proven catastrophically wrong. But there was something almost tragic about a man who had boarded an airplane believing he owned the world and now found himself trapped in a foreign country with nothing but legal problems and regret. "What does he want to discuss?" Maya asked. "According to his attorney, he wants to apologize personally and discuss possible restitution." Maya almost laughed at the irony. Gregory Blackstone, who had lost everything because of his treatment of her, was now hoping that she might be willing to help him recover some portion of what his prejudice had cost him. "Schedule the meeting," Maya said after a moment of consideration. "But make it clear that I'm under no obligation to provide assistance or accept any agreement he might propose." David nodded and made a note in his phone. "There's also media interest. 60 Minutes has requested an interview, and several business schools want you to speak about discrimination in financial services." Maya returned to her desk, considering how much of her story she was willing to share publicly. The incident on the airplane had been personal, but its implications were systemic, revealing patterns of discrimination that existed throughout industries that managed trillions of dollars in global capital. "Set up the university speeches," she said finally. "This needs to be about more than one man's mistakes. It needs to be about changing systems that allow those mistakes to happen repeatedly." As David left to coordinate Maya's expanding schedule of speaking engagements and media appearances, she opened her laptop and began reviewing acquisition agreements for the European properties that Gregory's collapse had made available. The work continued. Deals were structured, and financed markets responded to new realities created by the intersection of principles and power. Outside her window, New York moved with its characteristic urgency, unaware that a conversation about airplane seats had fundamentally altered how discrimination cases would be handled in industries where reputation and trust formed the foundation of trillion-dollar relationships. Maya Richardson had not set out to become a symbol of anything larger than her own dignity. But the financial markets had a way of amplifying individual actions into systemic changes, and her refusal to accept unequal treatment had become a new standard for how power should respond to prejudice. Maya Richardson stood in the reception area of her expanded Manhattan offices, watching the morning sun stream through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of a city that had subtly but definitively adjusted its understanding of power consequence and the cost of assumptions. Richardson Capital Holdings now occupied 3 full floors of the building, rather than one housing a workforce that had doubled in size and a portfolio that had grown to encompass financial interests across 4 continents. The past 6 months had transformed her from a successful but relatively private financier into something approaching a public figure, though she had been careful to control that visibility with the same precision she applied to investment strategies. The speaking engagements at business schools had led to congressional testimony. The congressional testimony had led to policy recommendations, and the policy recommendations had created new standards for how discrimination cases were handled in industries where reputation translated directly into profit or loss. James knocked on her office door at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying the morning briefing folder that had grown substantially thicker since what the business press had started calling the Zurich incident. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming a case study taught in MBA programs, a cautionary tale shared in corporate boardrooms, and a reference point for anyone who needed to understand how quickly prejudice could become financially catastrophic. The quarterly impact report, James said, settling the folder on Maya's desk with the satisfied expression of someone whose boss had become the subject of Harvard Business School case studies. Maya opened the folder, scanning metrics that quantified how dramatically her profile and influence had expanded. Speaking invitations from major universities, partnership proposals from European banks, consulting requests from Fortune 500 companies seeking to audit their own vulnerability to discrimination-related financial risks. The diversity initiative is ahead of schedule, James reported. We've funded 47 startups led by underrepresented entrepreneurs with an average return rate that's outperforming the broader market by 18%. Maya smiled at the numbers, recognizing that her personal experience with discrimination had evolved into a business strategy that was both profitable and purposeful. The companies she funded were succeeding not because of charity or social responsibility, but because talented people who had been overlooked by traditional financing sources were proving to be excellent investments when given access to adequate capital. "Any word from Zurich?" Maya asked, referring to a question she posed every few weeks, but never expected to receive the answer she was anticipating. James checked his phone, then nodded toward the conference room. "Actually, yes. He's here." Maya felt a moment of genuine surprise. Gregory Blackstone had been requesting meetings with her for months, but she had assumed he was still trapped in Switzerland by legal proceedings that seemed to generate new complications every time they appeared to be nearing resolution. "He's in New York, arrived yesterday on a commercial flight coach class. His attorney says the Swiss government released his passport after he reached a settlement agreement with the bankruptcy court." Maya stood and walked to the conference room windows, looking down at streets where Gregory had once moved with the confidence of someone who assumed the city existed for his convenience. The man who had told her to learn her place would now be asking for her assistance, creating an irony so perfect that it felt like something from a novel rather than real life. "Send him in," Maya said. Gregory Blackstone entered the conference room with the careful movements of someone who was no longer certain of his welcome anywhere. 6 months had aged him dramatically, adding gray to his hair and lines to his face that spoke of stress, sleepless nights, and the particular exhaustion that came from losing everything and having to rebuild an identity from nothing. He wore a suit that looked expensive from a distance but showed signs of wear when examined closely. The kind of clothing that suggested someone was maintaining appearances on a budget that no longer supported the lifestyle those appearances were meant to convey. Miss Richardson, Gregory said, his voice carrying none of the entitled confidence that had characterized their first meeting. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Maya remained standing, studying his face for signs of the arrogance and casual cruelty that had defined their airplane encounter. What she saw instead was something that looked like genuine remorse mixed with the hollow exhaustion of complete financial collapse. "Mr. Blackstone," she replied neutrally. "I understand you've had a difficult few months." Gregory's laugh was bitter and self-aware. "That's one way to put it. I lost everything, Miss Richardson. My company, my properties, my marriage, my reputation. I'm living in a studio apartment in Queens and working as a freelance consultant for people who used to work for me." Maya sat down across from him, noting how the power dynamic between them had completely reversed. 6 months ago, Gregory had been the one with assumed authority dismissing her as someone who didn't belong in his presence. Now he was supplicant, hoping for assistance from the woman whose dignity he had casually attacked. "What can I do for you?" "Mr. Blackstone." Gregory reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it on the table between them with the reverent care of someone handling a sacred document. "I've written you a letter," he said. "Not a business proposal, not a request for money. An apology. A real one." Maya glanced at the paper but didn't pick it up. "I'm listening. Miss Richardson, I want you to understand that I know exactly what I did wrong. It wasn't that I didn't know who you were, though that was part of it. It was that I didn't think it mattered who you were. I assumed that my comfort, my status, my sense of belonging was more important than yours, and I was wrong in the most expensive way possible." Maya remained silent, letting Gregory continue his confession. "I've spent 6 months learning what it feels like to be dismissed, to have people make assumptions about my worth based on my appearance, to be told I don't belong in places I used to take for granted. I've been evicted from restaurants, denied service at stores, treated like I was trying to steal something just by existing in spaces where people didn't think I belonged." Gregory's voice cracked slightly on the words, revealing someone who had genuinely been transformed by experiencing the other side of discrimination. "I understand now that what I did to you wasn't just rude or inappropriate. It was a form of violence, the kind of casual cruelty that people like me inflict on people like you every day without thinking about it, without considering the cost." Maya picked up the letter, scanning its contents quickly. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the words chosen with the precision of someone who had spent months thinking about what he wanted to say and how he wanted to say it. "This is very thoughtful," Maya said, folding the letter and placing it in her jacket pocket. "What do you want from me?" Gregory straightened slightly, seeming to gather courage for whatever request he was about to make. "I want to work for you," he said. Maya blinked in surprise. Of all the possibilities she had considered for this meeting, Gregory asking for employment had not been among them. "Explain." "I know real estate, Miss Richardson. I know European markets, international financing, complex transactions. I lost everything because of my character, but my expertise is still valuable." Gregory leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the intensity of someone making a final pitch. "I want to work for someone who holds people accountable, who enforces standards that matter. I want to learn how to use my experience to build something better rather than just make myself richer." Maya studied his face, looking for signs that this was performance rather than genuine transformation. What she saw was something that looked like humility, a quality that Gregory had clearly been forced to develop through circumstances that had stripped away every defense mechanism he had previously relied upon. "The salary would be entry-level," Maya said, finally. "You'd report to junior associates, people half your age who would have authority over your work. I understand. You'd be on probation indefinitely. Any sign of the behavior that got you into this situation, any indication that you think you deserve special treatment because of your background or experience, and you'd be terminated immediately." Gregory nodded eagerly. "I understand completely." Maya looked out the conference room windows at the city where Gregory had once believed he owned the world, considering whether redemption was possible for someone whose prejudice had been so casual and complete. "Report to James on Monday morning," she said. "He'll explain your responsibilities and the standards you'll be expected to meet." Gregory's relief was visible and immediate, transforming his posture from supplication to something approaching hope. "Miss Richardson, I can't tell you how much this means to me." "Don't thank me yet," Maya replied. "You haven't proven that you've actually changed. You've only proven that you've learned what consequences feel like." The Hart Senate office building hummed with the particular energy that accompanied congressional hearings on topics that had captured public attention, and Maya Richardson could feel that energy building as she walked through corridors lined with portraits of legislators who had shaped American policy for over 2 centuries. The hearing room was already filling with senators, staff members, financial industry representatives and reporters who understood that today's testimony would likely influence how discrimination cases were handled in industries that managed trillions of dollars in global capital. Senator Patricia Murray of Washington, the committee chair, had invited Maya to testify on discrimination in financial services, how market forces can enforce civil rights. A hearing that had grown out of academic papers and business school case studies that treated Maya's airplane encounter with Gregory Blackstone as a watershed moment in corporate accountability. Maya took her seat at the witness table, noting the mixture of curiosity and respect in the faces surrounding her. 6 months earlier, she had been a successful but relatively private financier. Now she was being asked to explain how individual acts of discrimination could create risks that threatened entire industries and market sectors. Miss Richardson, Senator Murray began as the hearing was called to order. Thank you for joining us today. Your experience on a commercial flight has become a case study in how quickly discrimination incidents can escalate into significant financial consequences. Can you walk us through what happened? Maya had told this story dozens of times in various settings, but never before a Senate committee with C-SPAN cameras broadcasting live to a national audience. She spoke clearly and without emotion, describing the initial confrontation, Gregory's behavior, and her decision to use her company's financial leverage to enforce consequences for discrimination. At what point did you decide to take action? Asked Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina. When I realized that remaining silent was enabling a system that assumed I didn't deserve equal treatment because of how I looked, Maya replied. I had the resources to respond immediately and proportionally, and I chose to use them. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts leaned forward, her expression indicating that she understood the broader implications of Maya's story. Miss Richardson, your response was unusually swift and decisive compared to traditional civil rights remedies, which can take years to resolve through litigation. Do you see financial accountability as a more effective deterrent to discrimination? Maya considered the question, carefully aware that her answer would likely influence policy recommendations that emerged from the hearing. Senator Warren, traditional legal remedies are important, but they often provide justice after damage has already been done. Financial markets respond to reputational risks in real time, creating immediate consequences for behavior that threatens market stability and consumer confidence. Can you elaborate on that? Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's economically inefficient. When talented people are excluded from opportunities because of prejudice, when customers are mistreated because of assumptions, when business decisions are based on bias rather than merit, entire markets underperform. Financial institutions are beginning to understand that discrimination is a form of systemic risk that can be measured, managed, and priced. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, representing the committee's more conservative members, posed a different kind of challenge. Miss Richardson, some observers have criticized your response as disproportionate. A man lost his entire business empire over a seating dispute. Don't you think that's excessive? Maya had anticipated this question and prepared for it carefully, understanding that her answer would define how her actions were interpreted by people who might be uncomfortable with the idea that discrimination could have such severe consequences. Senator Hawley Gregory Blackstone didn't lose his business because of a seating dispute. He lost it because his behavior revealed exactly the kind of judgment that makes someone unsuitable for managing hundreds of millions of dollars in other people's money. Maya paused, letting the distinction settle before continuing. When someone demonstrates casual prejudice when they assume they have the right to determine who belongs where based on appearance, they're showing that their decision-making process is fundamentally flawed. Financial markets cannot afford to trust capital to people whose judgment is compromised by bias. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota nodded approvingly. So you're saying that discrimination is itself a form of risk assessment? Exactly. And it's usually wrong, which makes it expensive. Companies that exclude qualified people because of prejudice underperform companies that make decisions based on merit. Financial institutions that discriminate against customers lose market share to competitors that don't. Prejudice is bad business, and markets are becoming more sophisticated about identifying and penalizing it. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering topics that ranged from regulatory frameworks to market mechanisms to the role of individual accountability in creating systemic change. Maya found herself articulating ideas that she hadn't fully formed before the questions forced her to examine the broader implications of her actions. Miss Richardson Senator Murray said as the session began to wind down, "What would you like to see come out of today's hearing?" Maya looked around the room, taking in faces that represented different perspectives on how markets and morality should intersect, how individual rights should be protected, and how rapidly changing business environments should be regulated. "I'd like to see recognition that discrimination isn't just a civil rights issue, it's an economic issue," she said. "I'd like to see financial regulators require institutions to measure and report on discrimination risks, the same way they report on credit risks or market risks. And I'd like to see business schools teach courses on how prejudice creates inefficiencies that can be eliminated through better systems and better accountability." After the hearing ended, Maya found herself surrounded by reporters, policy advocates, and business representatives who wanted to discuss implementation strategies, regulatory frameworks, and the practical challenges of creating accountability systems that could operate at the speed of modern financial markets. But the conversation that mattered most happened in a quiet corridor outside the hearing room where Gregory Blackstone waited with the patient posture of someone who was no longer certain he had the right to demand anyone's attention. "I watched the hearing online," he said as Maya approached. "You handled their questions better than most seasoned politicians." "Thank you," Maya replied, noting how completely Gregory's demeanor had changed from entitled executive to respectful employee in the months since she had hired him. "Miss Richardson, I wanted you to know that your testimony helped me understand something I didn't realize before." "What's that?" Gregory's expression was serious, almost solemn. "When I treated you the way I did on that airplane, I wasn't just being rude to one person. I was demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that made me unsuitable for the responsibilities I thought I deserved." Maya studied his face, recognizing genuine understanding rather than performance. "You cost me everything," Gregory continued, "but you also saved me from continuing to make choices that were destroying my character along with my business." Maya nodded, satisfied that Gregory's transformation appeared to be genuine rather than strategic. "Keep working on becoming someone who deserves the opportunities you're given," she said. "That's the only redemption that matters." 1 year later, Maya Richardson stood before the newly established National Business Ethics Council, an organization born from the ripple effects of one denied seat. Airlines now display Richardson principles in training materials. Financial institutions have mandatory bias training and discrimination settlements, fund scholarships for underrepresented entrepreneurs. The airplane incident had become something larger than personal vindication, evolving into a framework that helped entire industries understand the hidden costs of prejudice and the competitive advantages of genuine equality. Gregory Blackstone, now managing a community center in Queens, sent Maya a handwritten letter every few months, not seeking forgiveness, but expressing gratitude for the harsh lesson that saved him from a life of blind privilege. He volunteers teaching financial literacy to immigrants, finally understanding that true worth comes from lifting others up, not keeping them down. His transformation from entitled executive to community servant had become another case study. This one focused on how consequences could create character when applied with precision and purpose. Maya rarely thinks about that flight anymore, except when she sees young professionals of color walking confidently into rooms that once would have questioned their presence. The seat was never about the seat. It was about every door that assumed it had the right to remain closed, every system that mistook comfort for justice, every moment when power chose convenience over principle. Today those doors open a little wider, and Maya Richardson continues her work in the quiet spaces where real change happens, one decision at a time. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts about how conversations across difference have changed your own perspective. Together we can build bridges of understanding, one dialogue at a time.